You are conscious that there are people here, very good, nice, well-meaning people who may have spent 6 months, a year, maybe even longer, working on this transaction that they've brought you into, where you're about to say, possibly no, but possibly really hard to do it in the way that you really, really wanted to do it. It does take its toll.
Every organization faces moments that test its principles. When the stakes are high and the timelines are short and the answers aren't clear. In this episode, my colleague Bernhard Gehra sat down with Satnam Lehal, a senior compliance leader. During Bernhard and Satnam's conversation, they talk through what it takes to lead through uncertainty, how to make sound decisions under pressure, and how to help organizations respond, not just react, when things start to go off track. Whether it's asking better questions, building muscle around execution, or learning how not to overpromise when things are burning, this episode offers a playbook for the kind of leadership crisis demands. This is BCG on Compliance, a podcast that explores today's most pressing financial crime trends and how compliance professionals are adapting to stay ahead of that curve. I'm Hanyo Seibert.
Satnam, very warm welcome. Great to have you. Perhaps you can give us a small background into who you are and your career.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Dr. Gehra. I'm sure I can call you Bernard for the rest of the show. So my background, I'm originally from the UK. I grew up in Leicester in the UK. I studied politics and philosophy at Oxford and then worked in financial services for all my career since then. A large proportion of that has been in regulation. I've worked at a large US bank, and then I went to work for a Danish organization called Danske Bank. And so, yeah, that's been my background.
Thank you so much. But how did you finally end up working in the compliance field, Satnam?
Yes, and I note your phrase, end up. It's not the sort of job you hear about when you're 16 or 18 and think that's what I want to do. Although I think post-financial crisis, I have found, particularly when I've been doing recruitment, this area has become more and more of a profession, and people are objectively interested in coming to work in regulation in-house or at a regulator rather than other parts of financial services. I think, the reality of most people's careers is you take opportunities when they arise. It isn't always entirely designed by you. So I guess another way of sort of answering your question is, why have I stayed in compliance and what do I find fulfilling about it? I would say a few things. Firstly, I think anyone who works in compliance, more or less, you're probably working in an industry where society has said that this is an industry where if there is a failure or problem, the externalities of that problem are beyond just an organizational. And that's why I think, generally speaking, societies regulate. So therefore, you are probably doing a job in an industry that has high impact, and it matters to not just the shareholders and the board of that company, but it matters to society. And then I think the final thing I would say is, I think when you work in compliance in an organization, you do get, I would say, a disproportionate opportunity to have an impact. And particularly at earlier stages in your career, one thing I'm always quite amazed about, but also sometimes kind of as a manager concerned about is, we have people working for us who are going into rooms, often dealing with much more senior people, dealing with quite potentially high risk, high reward issues. And it strikes me that in financial services, those people who are working in compliance really do have an outsized ability to have an impact on their organization and the economies and societies at large. That's not to say that there aren't other joys of working in as a junior M&A banker or as a trader or in asset management, but I think for me that's been quite an appealing part of compliance.
This sounds like an extremely exciting and purposeful job. And given all your experience, if you need to summarize what makes a good compliance officer, how would you characterize this position?
Two things I would say that particularly I look out for. One is at senior levels, I look for people who can make sound judgments and are willing to apply those judgments. And I'm going to talk about both of those, right? Now, firstly, when I was younger in my career, I hated hearing people say, you know what you need is sound judgment, because what that sounded like was you just need to be more experienced, which sounded like you just need to be older, right? So you will get here, just be patient, young man. And once you've accumulated enough experience, you too could make good judgment. And I have thought about how to teach judgment, and I think I've not found a formula, right? I think there's various things, but I think it is a hard thing to do. So I now, as I get older, I'm relying on this kind of age card and saying it comes with age. The second part about applying it, I do think, and we can perhaps talk about this more if you want, there are a number of reasons why I see people who actually have good judgment would probably make a, on balance, good quality decision, which is not the same as, in retrospect, the right decision. But for various reasons can be reluctant to apply it or slow to apply it. And too often, I think, in compliance, we sometimes do the get me more information answer, or if only I knew X, Y, and Z, or please go and ask the customer for yet this as well. There can be other things, the culture of the work organization you are in, the way the organization's reacted in the past when judgments were made which didn't pay off, and how do you respond to that? That can also reinforce negative behaviors. And the second thing I would say about what makes a good compliance officer, this is actually something that someone told me, a boss of mine told me about 15 years ago, and it resonated, and I've been consciously applying it. And he said to me, in compliance at senior levels, you need to be able to both get into the detail and be able to think strategically. And on top of that, know when to apply which of those two approaches. Now, again, I'm sure there's lots of industries and lots of senior jobs where you could say that's the case. Why is it relevant to compliance? I think quite often in compliance, particularly when making judgments, your decision will hinge on something quite specific. And that's where the sort of detail part comes in. The reverse is, I think, quite often I see very good quality compliance officers who really understand their products, really understand what we would call client relationships. They understand the organization's sort of idiosyncrasies, and they really understand regulation, but aren't thinking about what will my function look like in 12 months' time or in 3 years' time, or what will be needed from me in this organization for us to continue to be successful or relevant. So I think those two things, I would say, are characteristics, qualities, which I think are important to be successful in compliance. And I would say to people who don't yet have them, these are all learned things, right? You can acquire them and just be very purposeful, conscious, and deliberate when you're working to see how you accumulate these and practice these skills as you get more senior within compliance.
One of the most demanding tests for any compliance leader is helping an organization rebuild when trust has been strained. In 2019, Satnam joined Danske Bank at a pivotal moment, stepping into a role that required not only technical expertise, but calm, clear direction. He played a central role in shaping the bank's remediation efforts and guiding the organization through a period of intense scrutiny. It wasn't easy, but under his leadership, the bank transformed how it managed compliance risks. We wanted to get a sense of what he had learned during this time.
I think sometimes it's helpful to differentiate between problems versus crises, right? Good, well-run organizations have day-to-day compliance problems, and that's absolutely fine and okay. If you aren't, either you're operating in a very, very commercially zero-risk environment, or you're not good at detecting problems. Right. So day-to-day problems, please don't be afraid of it. I say, this is what we're here to do, right? And mature organizations get that. And I think sometimes compliance officers can become sort of perfectionists and sort of think their success is inversely related to the number of problems an organizations have. And so these sort of what I might call day-to-day potential problems, actual problems, crystallized risks on small things, any organization that has something like a risk appetite, which is greater than zero, will, if they're successful enough, they will have these issues. And I would separate them from what I call crises. And crises are, when they're reaching a certain proportion. And one of the things in my experience of having witnessed crises myself and then having spoken to other people is there's very rarely one root cause. Often a number of things have happened together which have culminated in what would otherwise potentially have been just a problem becoming a crisis. Organizations where there's a degree of complacency, contentment in our past, a belief in some form of sort of exceptionalism. We are good people here, and we are also very smart people here. So that thing that happened at sort of second tier competitor firm over there wouldn't happen here. Now, I want to be careful, organizations who invest in themselves, who invest in their exceptionalism and credibly have it, they should feel rightly some degree of payback for that, right? So I'm not sort of saying it's as simple as that's always bad, but I have sometimes seen that, which I think is fertile ground for when a problem transforms into a crisis. So that's one thing I think. And you see that, and this is why now good organizations do things like lessons learned, right? They sort of say, well, hold on, this happened there, might it happen here? And why wouldn't it happen here, right? Another thing that I've seen which can happen is organizations being slow to grasp the magnitude of the problem and then slow to act on it. And those perhaps are two related things. In good organizations I've worked at, they seem to almost daily have this sort of, it's a bit like an accident emergency unit. They're constantly triaging risk. And they're doing it regularly, right? And they're not just doing it with just compliance risk. They're looking across the spectrum of all of their risk and thinking, problems occur, bring them to me. We are the senior management. We are going to discern on this list of 10 things, what 2 are the critical, what 3 are looks a bit bad, but could be okay, but let's kind of keep an eye on it. And which, look, we want them to get done, but we'll leave this, and this doesn't need to take senior management time. It can be dealt with by other people that we can delegate to, etc. They're very, very good at quickly appraising an issue and making judgments about the severity of it. Then there's a question of how good organizations, once they have their problem, how they then go about remediating it, right? And we'll all know, and across the industry will know, there are organizations who seem to had a problem and seem to have dealt with a very public problem, saying, let's say crisis now, because if it's public, it probably was crisis, and have been better at fixing it. And by the way, perhaps we can talk about this. I think organizations, I wouldn't wish this upon anyone, but most organizations who go through on these and do it well, they develop some amazing skills, right? It can be a great way of improving your regulatory relations, etc., right? So, but there are other organizations who I think will observe that weren't as good or took longer or spent much, much more money, frankly, on a remediation. Now, we could speak about this at length about what makes a successful remediation. A few things I will point out that I think people really should focus on. One, I think once there's a crisis, there is a lot of incentive and temptation to overcommit the organization. It can feel sometimes close to existential, your problem. And so everyone is minded to promise the world. And I think in those early days, it's really, really important for senior people to be absolutely ruthless about what's realistic and how long this is going to take, what order we're going to do it, and resist the temptation to make unrealistic promises in order to get yourself through that difficult board meeting or that difficult shareholder conversation or that rough regulatory conversation. I think a second thing that I've seen happens again in the early days is that those commitments can be made to regulators or to the markets, and they're too imprecise. They're too general. And being very clear on what is it you're going to actually do, I think is quite critical. And that involves expertise. That does involve having perhaps people who've seen this before sitting in the room. So I think being very crystal clear on what it is you're going to deliver, how you know you're going to be done, is really important in those early days. It's easy to start a remediation. Ending one is often a challenge. It's often a challenge for organizations, and we see that. You see that, and we don't have to mention names, but there are organizations out there who are struggling to get to the ending. The final thing I would say is, and this is just about skills, that's not to belittle it, you need to have people who are obsessively good at execution. what I see is a lot of organizations who, and certainly after they've had a crisis, it is without question, the tone from the top is right at the organization. And without question, the organization is allocating money, right? Now, some steps might need to be taken to get to that point, change of management, whatever. But nevertheless, organizations get to that point. Why is it that those organizations struggle to get things done? And I think one of the things is, if I look, my experience of working in large corporates, complex multinational organizations, I think a remediation, particularly a financial crimes remediation, is just objectively one of the biggest organizational transformations that any organization undertakes. It involves not just the compliance department. It involves technology, operations, audit, legal, most of your business areas, your customers. It is one hell of a disruption. It requires your finest project managers, your finest leaderships, people with the broadest leadership skills, who often, unfortunately, sit elsewhere in the organization. You need to summon those and bring them into this project.
While it's important to manage the real-time stress of a remediation, it's also important to plan for the future.
If you would advise a CEO, what would be the top 3 questions she or he should ask the Chief Compliance Officer, so even if no incident happened in the last years?
So this is a question a CEO can ask of their Chief Compliance Officer. Boards, I would encourage regulators to ask this as well. So one, I think, is your Chief Compliance Officer should be able to tell you what their function and compliance risk in the organization will look like in 1, 3, and 5 years. And they should give you the key steps they're taking to get them there. I think that's an important question to be asked in order to get away from this senior people and clients helping the organization to get through the day, get through this transaction, this quarter, right? That is a valuable, important, is a part of the day job, and it's really, really valuable, and that's why we exist. That's a part of the service you provide, what's used to call classic coverage compliance. But the senior management of the compliance function needs to be able to answer that question. Hopefully get it right, but that's not that hard. I think there's another question I think I ask of people working for me, and I think a Chief Compliance Officer should ask the compliance officers, if you had 5% more in your resources broadly defined, it's not just the head count, it's not just the compliance department's head count, but if we kind of put 5% more on this thing called compliance risk management, what would you allocate it to? And reversely, if we took 5% off you, what would you stop doing? And I'd be very scared if my Chief Compliance Officer wasn't able to answer that as if they thought about it before, and to answer it with some degree of kind of backing up that persuaded me that they were right. I want to say one further question, which I think a Chief Compliance Officer, the CEO, should ask is, I think a good CEO should be asking their CCO and a good board, what can we or the rest of this organization do differently to be better? I think maybe I'm just projecting my own feelings, but even in the best organization I've worked in, when you're a compliance officer, even when they've got a very good culture towards risk management, yada, 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 it is just human nature that if you work in a risk function, you are conscious that you're not a revenue generator, you're cost. You are conscious that there are people here, very good, nice, well-meaning people who may have spent 6 months, a year, maybe even longer, working on this transaction that they've brought you into, where you're about to say, possibly no, but possibly really hard to do it in the way that you really, really wanted to do it. It does take its toll. It does have an impact. So I think senior management, CEOs and boards would benefit from being reminded of that. And I think absolutely, when I've had conversations with board members, often in sort of one-to-one, I think their primary job is to act as a challenge and a scrutiny of the executive, of which the Chief Compliance Officer is typically one. But I think there's a secondary role they play as well, which is also being a support. And I think that's not often written in the duties of directors in countries' laws, but I think it's an important role that they play. And good CEOs do this.
So if we fast forward in 5 years from now, how do you think a compliance department or the role of a chief compliance officer could look like in 5 years from now?
One thing that future compliance departments are going to have to do much more than they've done hitherto is much deeper collaboration between compliance and the technology and the operations function. It does happen. I think at larger organizations, it probably happens more. In financial crime, it probably happens more than other parts of compliance because there's quite a lot of already linkages between operation and technology. But I think that's going to happen in a much, much more deeper way. Historically, compliance, I think, sort of, had some interaction with these, but compliance for itself is sort of dealing directly with the business and not sideways. And you kind of went through the business and then the business COOs coordinated technology and ops. I think it's going to have to be a lot more sideways and much deeper. And I see some very good examples of this, particularly with the US banks. So I think that will be one big feature. My wish, and it's less of a prediction, is I think if we think about how compliance risk will be managed, I think we do need to think more about how it is managed at a system level and less by individual organization. I think there is a limit to what any individual organization is, limited by just the nature of transactions, right? Limited by data. If we as a society want to have the next big impact and dent on this, it's going to have to be looked at. That's definitely going to be on the areas like fraud and transaction monitoring, and also with adjacent industries.
Are you looking far enough into the future of your organization? Join the conversation by connecting with us on your podcast app, writing a review of the show, or emailing us at bcgoncompliance@bcg.com. I'm Hanyo Seibert. Thanks for listening.